Holy and living God. Amen. Please be seated. So stories like this are all too common today. A news story last week headed that an American Airlines flight from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. made a rapid emergency landing in Kansas City after an unruly passenger tried to break into the cockpit and then attempted to open an exit door of an airplane in flight. The passenger was apparently subdued by crew members and other passengers when he was hit over the head with a coffee pot. Now, I think it's probably fairly obvious that he must have had mental health issues. I don't know. But it seems to me as though stories like this are more and more common. That hair-trigger rage that always seems to be just below the surface. Last December, the New York Times ran an article entitled, "Rudeness is on the Rise. You got a problem with that?" In it, the author laments the rising tide of rage and meanness in our COVID-weary culture. How do we respond to a world under stress, a culture in which the guardrails of so-called civility are gone? The evidence of that stress is everywhere. We seem to have lost the capacity for gracious communal living, at least if you read the news. I'm wary of it all. I try not to get drawn in, but a few minutes checking Apple News and I'm off. Here I go again. I swear I wasn't going to look at it this time. And my coping strategies are not always healthy or helpful. And into this, here comes Jesus' hard teaching again. And Jesus was certainly speaking in times that were every bit as turbulent and in many ways more dangerous. A time of oppressive power structures, and Jesus well knew the dangers. And yet, he says, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, forgive and you will be forgiven. And at times, this can sound hopelessly naive, even passive. Someone has deeply harmed you. Power oppresses people, and we turn the other cheek and let them do it again? Well, brothers and sisters, we're followers of Jesus, and we acknowledge that this passage is a central teaching of his. So we must attend to it. We must ask, what is it that wants to be known in me from this teaching? I say to you that listen, love your enemies. When we speak of love as Christians, we're not talking about warm emotional feelings. We know those come and go, even with those we care the most deeply about. That's not what it is. Christian love means knowing that I abide in God's love, and so do you, and so do my enemies. Christian love means that I open myself up to the other with respect for their full personhood. Christian love means recognizing that every person has a God center in them, whether they know it or not. And sometimes that God center is deeply buried under hurts and wounds. In times of conflict and turbulence, I'm invited to step back and center myself in God's presence in me and in you, and let that be my power. Walter Wink is a well-known scholar and is very helpful in showing us how Jesus' words would have been understood in his own time. First, we know that Jesus never advocates violence. Never. This is as good a golden rule as any. If it is violent, it is not Christ-like. It is not. Period. At the same time, Jesus does call on his followers to resist evil and to find non-violent ways of doing that. Turning the other cheek, in Matthew's gospel it's clear, it says, if you are struck on your right cheek. Turning the other cheek would force an abuser to use his left hand. Using your left hand was a punishable offense. Remember, you would strike a worthy opponent, an equal, with your fist, right? You would strike a subordinate with the back of your hand, using your right hand. This is tricky to get our arms around. But what Jesus is telling people when he says turn the other cheek is either to force the person who hit you to hit you as an equal, or to risk fines himself by striking you with his left hand. His hearers would have known that. Likewise, having your outer cloak taken from you was a form of subjugation. Taking your shirt was forbidden. Offering it means you stand naked before the oppressor and make their cruelty obvious. The same with going the extra mile. It was forbidden to ask someone to demand that someone take your goods for the second mile. So Jesus' hearers would have heard it in this way: stand in your own skin and in the dignity of your own personhood, resisting evil without getting caught in the cycle of violence. Because it is all too easy to become the very thing we hate, which is exactly what happens. We see it all the time when we meet violence with violence, hate with hate. Jesus' third way invites us to put God at the center and not get caught up in our own rage, resentment, and retaliation, however justified it might be. Joseph, in our Old Testament reading, gives us a glimpse of this very thing. That helpful introduction reminds us that Joseph had been his father's favorite. His father gave him, remember the coat of many colors? His father gives him that beautiful coat, and Joseph, being immature and kind of bratty, waves it around. Hey, look at this, Dad's favorite. Well, his brothers, after many years of this, have a murderous rage and try to kill him, and eventually settle for selling him to a caravan. And the story is long and winding. It's the longest story in the book of Genesis. But Joseph eventually rises to a place of power and prominence. And when famine causes his brothers to come to Egypt looking for food, and they recognize their brother who they have wronged, they're fearful that he is going to exact his revenge on them. Instead, he offers forgiveness. But here's the key thing. As this story is being told in Genesis, God is nowhere to be found. God isn't mentioned. It's only when Joseph reflects back on his life that he's able to see how God has been at work. Through all the danger, the jealousy, the abandonment, the imprisonment, being a stranger in a strange land. Joseph reframes the horrible events of his life to include the redemptive artistry of God. Joseph gets a wider view of things. The story is much bigger than his own personal story, his own personal hurts and grievances. It's not about his grievances. And once he sees that, he's able to forgive. What I am not saying is that God causes the brothers to try to kill him. I don't believe that. What I am saying is that God is always and everywhere in the business of taking the worst things that happen to us and working on them for the purpose of wholeness and blessing. Because God is in the story, there is always hope of resurrection. But God cannot do that work in us if we are stuck in a place of resentment and anger and grievance. A friend of mine said to me once, there have been times in my life when I felt like I was wandering through a dark wood. But I look back and see that it was a highway. I see that unbeknownst to me, I was being guided and led and held. God is always at work in this present moment, in your life, in my life, and in the world. And our work is to see it, is to see God at work, to open ourselves up to that redemptive grace, to see where we can participate in the world's healing. So I invite you to pray with this passage this week. I invite you to ask God to open you up to your own stuck places, and believe me, we all have them. To ask God to show you where God has been at work in your times of greatest trial. And then pray for God to show you. Please, Lord, help me step into your presence and be a force for love, because the world needs it now more than ever. Amen.